nutrient loading, greenhouse gases, and I'll skip through, but I think I've presented some of that work here before. In potato and dairy farm systems, we've been looking at nutrient loading, and this is also an important environmental measure for all kinds of reasons. Lots of farming systems in Canada are challenged with nitrate losses and PEI from conventional potato production, phosphate losses all through Quebec, eastern Canada, major problems with water impact, etc. So how do organic farms stack up? Now, most of my data here has been working in eastern Canada on this issue, but we're doing more national work, I would say, on phosphorus now with the U.S. here as well. But in terms of dairy and potato farming systems, what we did on some dairy farms going back a few years ago was look at the nutrient flows through the whole farm. So it's 15 long-term dairy farms in Ontario. And so they've been running organic 10 to 30 years, some of these farms. And just to simplify what we did, basically we looked at everything coming into the farm, quantified it in terms of nutrients, N, P, and K, then looked at, and the nice thing about working with organic farms is that's usually all very well documented and recorded in terms of the imports onto the farm. So it's not enormously challenging to do this, to translate that for every year, what's the total N, P, and K. One of the challenging ones on the N is the legume nitrogen fixation, but given reasonable estimates of that once we know what's in each field. And then how much is leaving in terms of products. And on the dairy farm it's overwhelmingly milk, and you can translate that into N, P, and K fairly easily and confidently as well. So what do you end up with? So what's the nutrient surplus, or what's accumulating in the fields, you might think of it as? How much phosphorus is accumulating in the fields? How much nitrogen is not leaving the farm as a product, but is being lost to the environment? And here's the kind of numbers we've got across the 15 farms. 75 kilograms, 1, 11. How do those compare? Well, many dairy farms in eastern Canada, conventional dairy farms, this number per hectare would be in the 30s, 20 or 30 kilograms of phosphorus accumulating in the soil per hectare per year, running very large nutrient surpluses with all kinds of risks of phosphorus losses because they're much more intensive systems, whereas the organic systems are far less intensive, and so the nutrient loading is much less, and the risks to the environment is much less. Potassium you wouldn't be worried about environmentally, nitrogen you would, but again those are very conservative numbers in terms of nitrogen. And they really compared with studies like this in Europe with organic dairy farms in Europe. We can do the same thing in potato farms, very different. We weren't looking at sort of farm imports and exports, but we were measuring, just going out again on conventional farms, measuring yield, nutrient uptake in the crop, and then what's left as nitrates, residual soil nitrates in the fall. It's the big issue in PEI. It's usually lost over the winter often to drinking water, to groundwater. It's a big concern in communities. So if we did the same measurement on an organic farm, well, they're very conservative systems. The amount of nitrogen kicking around in the crop is very moderate. It's not high. It's not 200 kilograms, it's 100 and something. And the amount of nitrates left is much less than the average of 60 or 70 you might get in conventional farms. So this is good news in terms of being very conservative nutrient-wise. Greenhouse gases, I was mentioning earlier that it's a bit of a black box still. It's very challenging to measure greenhouse gases and get a good net impact of green manures and the crop system. So we've been trying to do some of that over the last few years. We don't do it as much on farm because it's such intensive work. So we sort of mimic the farm rotations at the college and out measuring. This is just a picture of taking these kind of samples, gas samples. Or more closely, it might look like this. And we look at the sort of flux of nitrous oxide, which is the big one of nitrogen. And we're starting to get a picture. We're finishing up a long-term 5-year study this year, which will be really interesting to see. I'll show you a little bit of that study. And finding data that's starting to support what others have found in Europe. if it's a less intensive system in terms of nitrogen, whether it's a dairy, grain, potato system, it's no surprise that the actual emissions of nitrous oxide are lower. Are they lower per product? Don't know yet, but per hectare they are. We're doing, finishing up a 5-year rotation along these lines and doing a lot of greenhouse gas measurements, which we should have the results from later in the year, into next year. And there we're playing around, looking at different green manures, looking at different amendments, and trying to get again that idea of the net effect. So we're actually in the green manure measuring emissions, not just in the cash crop. We're trying to, just like the carbon idea, of just trying to look at the net effect of these different management options. I'll skip through some of the data. Generally, the red clover, the legume is much lower. That's all that's saying. The sort of an intensive crop where you're incorporating in terms of nitrous oxide. The type of green manure matters as well, so we can manage that. This is just the red clover giving a higher, in the following potato crop, there's much higher emissions than following the veg sequence. And so we have options there. And but if we added fertilizer in a sort of subplot system, we can really increase the yield without a cost in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And then if we were to factor in the energy cost of the fertilizer as well, I think that's something we would do.